Hello and welcome to Stand in the Gap. Today is part 2 of a 2-part series that we've entitled Re-engaging Parents and the Rise of Homeschooling in America. Last week on this program, we dealt with the genesis, the beginning of the homeschool movement back in the early 80s here in America. And we focused on the role of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association in the rise of homeschooling in America. We cited the cultural motivations that occurred in the in the 60s, transcending into the 70s, and actually has continued through to this very day with a dramatic exodus in children from the public school system into Christian education and specifically homeschooling. Isaac and I will again today engage this discussion with Mr. Scott Woodruff, Homeschool Legal Defense Association's Director of Legal and Legislative Advocacy, who is also a member of the Bar of the Supreme Court of the United States and a frequent speaker at homeschool conferences and on radio programs all across the country. Now, according to some educational historians, such as the Coalition for Responsible Home Education, they said, quote, "The modern homeschool movement began in the early 70s when John Holt, an educational theorist and supporter of school reform, began arguing that formal schools' focus on rote learning created an oppressive classroom environment designed to make children compliant employees. Holt called for parents to liberate their children from formal education and instead follow a method known by some as unschooling. But soon after, Holt's arguments inspired the first homeschoolers. Holt's friend, educational proponent Ray Moore, added his voice, arguing that early schooling was actually detrimental to children and that children should be schooled at home until age 8 or 9 in order to give them a firm educational, psychological, and moral foundation, end quote. Now, what I just gave there was from that article. But while this analysis may give the underpinning historically to homeschooling as a movement in the United States, homeschooling as an acceptable method is actually the first form of recorded education in human civilization. That's when parents taught their children how to live and work and write and think. And from a biblical perspective, what is in fact homeschooling was outlined very carefully in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, as an example, when God instructed parents, particularly fathers, to teach their children diligently at home and emphasized, do it diligently when they get up in the morning, when you walk during the day, when you sit down to eat, and when you lay down to sleep. That's what Deuteronomy 6 talks about. It's that type of 24-hour-a-day input by parents that really describes the uniqueness and the success of homeschooling. The content of that homeschooling in a biblical sense becomes truly unique, not just as a method, but as a means of inculcation of values which transcend generations. Moses told Israel in Deuteronomy chapter 6 to teach your children to love the Lord thy God with all thine heart and with all thy soul and with all thy might, and bind that truth upon their hands and frontlets before their eyes, and instruction fastened to the supports of your homes and upon the gates of your properties, so that the historically biblical model actually, you see, precedes what began as a movement in the United States in the 70s. And what a powerful movement it is. And with that, let me welcome back to the program again Scott Woodruff. Scott, thanks for being back with me today. Let's just do this. You've been a chief litigator, as you said in the last program, coming to the defense of parents who are actually jailed. The first homeschool parents back in the 70s and 80s actually were afraid that the sheriff would come and arrest them, and so they almost had to run out the back door. It's a shame. Amazing. But why is it? Explain this. Sometimes there are those who have used and said that homeschooling in education is like the canary in the coal mine. Why is homeschooling and what happens in this area critical for all parents, regardless of what they choose to do with their children and how they choose to educate them?
Sam, homeschooling is a very powerful statement that parents truly have an alternative. Many parents think there is no alternative to putting their kids in the public school. They feel trapped, they feel hopeless, they feel like there is no other way out. But we send a powerful message that yes, there is a way out. Yes, you can homeschool your kids. Let me give you an example, Sam. I was helping a woman in a very rural part of Appalachia, and this is the story she gave me. She said that she had attended public school and she had become pregnant twice out of wedlock before she graduated. She said she wanted to homeschool her kids to give them a better life than she herself had. And I think that's the heart cry of just about every parent who homeschools. They want to give their kids a better life than they themselves had, and they're pretty sure their kids are not going to have that life if they spend 12 years in a government school.
And with that, Scott, great setup, and that's why the defense of parents' rights, as you said, it's like the canary. The first response of an opposing governmental educational system is against the parent who says, I think I can do it myself, the biblical model, and that is why the movement of homeschool, Scott, and thank you for you and their predecessors in HSLDA for all that has been done, because it's benefited every parent in this nation, regardless of how they have chosen to educate their children. We'll be back, ladies and gentlemen, continue our discussion with Scott Woodruff in just a moment.
Truth, flexible or permanent? The Bible, ancient history, or powerfully relevant? Culture, a reflection of enlightenment or warning signs? The pastor, commentator, or frontline combatant? Every day, American Pastors Network speaks to these questions where and when they matter. With hundreds of affiliate radio stations nationwide, a website and mobile app screening today's headlines through the twin lenses of the Bible and the Constitution. Educating, informing, equipping. This is the American Pastors Network. The time is now to stand in the gap for truth.
Welcome back to Stand in the Gap, and today most of you who watch this program regularly, you know that Sam and I both are proponents of homeschooling your children, even at the very least, no matter where your children are going to school, that you recognize as a parent or a grandparent your God-given right to be in charge of what your children learn and to be involved in how they turn out, and for when it's possible to be able to educate them at home. I know in my life has been a big blessing, and so we're talking about this in our Part 2 interview with Scott Woodruff. He's an attorney with the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. Scott is the Director of Legal and Legislative Advocacy there at HSLDA. And Scott, I would say so much of what you and Sam have already talked about, well, what we talked about in our last program and already in this program, I just see those things happening in my own life. I've seen it with my own eyes. I know my dad was a pastor, but our church had a large Christian school. My dad was part of a national conference of Christian schools, and they worked so closely with the HSLDA. He would say, Mike Ferris, the founder, if he came over to their group and said, this is something that needs to be done, they said, we need to do it, because that whole canary in the coal mine thing, it was churches, not just Christian schools, but churches and all of our religious liberties, they realized were tied to parental liberties to educate their children, like the Pilgrims who left England to go to Holland, and then there was too much liberalism there, too much worldly influence, so they came to America. That was the same kind of thing going on, and they recognized that, and I see that. And as my wife and I, we're members of the HSLDA, and we benefit so much from it beyond just the legal defense. There's so many other things that you all are doing at the HSLDA to help direct, to help guide, to help network parents who want to rear their children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. But we do still worry. I live in the state of New York. We've homeschooled our children in Pennsylvania and in New York. And the laws are burdensome at times. And we get worried about what you said, that principals or superintendents might misapply. the laws and the freedoms that we have might be taken away. And so I would like to ask you, because HSLDA, they do so many things now, and anybody watching should look into it, but you are still a large part of it is the legal defense. What do you see on the legal side of things as maybe the number one overarching challenge over the years that homeschool families have faced?
Number one challenge in recent years is that public school officials invent new laws and present them to families as you have to do this. Let me give you an example in Virginia. A school district in the western part of the state said, you have to give us a copy of your birth certificate, your child's birth certificate, if you want to homeschool. That's not in the law. I wrote to their attorney and said, that's not the law. He said, this is our policy, and if your client doesn't give us his child's birth certificate, we're going to enforce the law against him. We filed a declaratory judgment action against that school district. The first judge, unsurprisingly, ruled against us. We appealed it to the Virginia Supreme Court, and they agreed with us 7-0 that the school had no power to invent their own laws for homeschoolers.
And that brings up an interesting point. I want to get into some of the other legal issues, but there are cases like that, and we see this over and over, and I read the newsletters from HSLDA, and it's a regular basis where they ask things that the law doesn't allow them to ask for. But some people might say, what is the problem? Why not just give them the birth certificate? Why not just give it? Why not just go along with that? Why at HSLDA is that such a big deal that you say this is the law and we are going to follow the letter of the law?
Well, Isaac, there are two ways to eat a cookie. You can stuff it in your mouth and gobble it all at once, or you can take really teeny-weeny nibbles around the edges. But with teeny-weeny nibbles, you'll sooner or later make the whole cookie disappear. We tell public school officials, not one nibble, not one.
That's great. That's great. Well, now, we were talking in our last program with you as we looked at this big change that's happened in the last 3 years since 2020, since the disaster that happened during the COVID lockdowns in the public school the public school systems. There's been a huge influx of new people, fresh blood, so to speak. Now people, instead of looking at me like, what, you homeschool your children, they're saying, oh, thumbs up, yeah, that's a great idea. We did that, we're doing that. Somebody I know is doing that, and it's just amazing. What are some of the new legal issues coming up, maybe as a result of things going on in the last 3 years that we wouldn't have even had to deal with, in the early days of homeschooling?
All right, here's one. Most of the homeschool statutes around the country were written when homeschoolers were a tiny minority. And the states that required people to file things maybe only had a couple hundred stacks of papers they had to shuffle. Now there are thousands and thousands, and states are realizing, hey, it's a lot of work shuffling all this paper. So several states have tried to force homeschoolers to file their paperwork through some kind of online system, even though that's not part of the law. We've told them, no, families don't need to file paperwork through your system. They can file it by paper. Also, your system insists that they provide information that the law does not require them to give. So in a sense, the popularity of homeschooling and the increasing administrative burden on public school staff is making them look for easy ways to do it. And easy for them means making us follow a computer program.
And Scott, I can comment, I can confirm from my perspective, I served in the Pennsylvania General Assembly for 18 years and on our education committee for 16 of those years. And so I was heavily involved in parental rights issues and in the laws governing homeschooling and education. And what you are saying, I was nodding my head. I wasn't on the screen so people could see me, but I was nodding my head saying, exactly. And although we had not talked before this program, what you said right there, I'm saying this is a potential area, and the area is whereas one time homeschooling was small and the mentality was squash this erupting potential because we've got to keep everybody in the system. Now it's become a movement. And there are many now involved, so now it becomes a threat of a different type. And how do you control? You burden people down with paperwork and bureaucracy. Speak to this one question that Isaac just mentioned to you, ask you, because I want you to expand on it just a bit before I get into having you answer some of the common fears that parents may have considering homeschooling. And that is this. There are many people who say, well, you know, if government tells me to do something, I need to do it. Okay, now, on one hand, we know biblically that is correct. But on the other hand, you just clearly said, but if they require us to do something that's not the law, and you have a government assistant making up laws, speak to why it's important for parents and homeschool parents to do the law, but not give up parental rights and give things according someone states the law, that's not the law. That's an important part, I think, what you just talked. Expand upon that just a bit.
Yeah, Sam, super important question. I address this all the time. Christians, sincere people of good faith, have a hard time embracing the concept that sometimes you have to tell that official no. And here's how I explain it. Romans 13, chapter about government authorities. There is a crucial part of that chapter where it says, give to everyone his due, tribute to whom tribute, honor to whom honor, duty to whom duty. It doesn't say give every official everything he wants. It says give them what is due. And in our system of government, what is due is determined by the laws. And so when an official asks one of our members to do something the law doesn't require, then they're asking for something that is not their due. And in my view, a Christian can in good conscience, in fact, respecting the divine order God has put in the world, which includes a proper role for officials, they can in good conscience say, no, thank you. And we can back them up and give them the legal defense they need if that official comes after them.
Scott, a tremendous and brief answer, but very, very powerful. And I wish we could spend an entire program, and maybe we'll get you back on to frankly expand upon that because it is so very, very important. But let me just shift for standpoint of the program here. We have people who are watching. Some are parents who have children. Some are homeschooling. Some have them in public schools. Some have them in Christian schools. We have a lot of grandparents who are watching, and they have grandchildren. All right, so you're speaking to this audience. But what would you, over the years, identify as perhaps the greatest fear that parents contacting Homeschool Legal Defense or whatever would say, I'm not satisfied about where my kids are being educated, or I want to educate them in the fear of the Lord, but homeschooling, I don't know if I can do it. Identify perhaps what you've seen to be the greatest fear, and then give a response to that.
Sure, Sam. Think about it this way. How long does it take to get a bachelor's degree in a college? About 4 years? By the time you've had a baby and reared that baby through years 1, 2, 3, and 4, that's about how long it takes to get a bachelor's degree. You have a bachelor's degree in expertise on your child by the time your child is 4. You are an expert on that child. You're the world's expert on that child. You've studied that child for 4 years. You've taken exams. You've been through tests. You've been through trials. You've studied that child. No one knows that child like you do. No one can educate that child as well as you can. Now, what's the basic fear? Oh, gee, it takes an expert to educate a child. The experts all live down at the government school. My response is, yes, it does take an expert, but you, Mom, you, Dad, are the expert in your child.
That's a great one. Okay, we got a minute left here before we say goodbye to you. What's the second greatest fear? And respond to that just like you just did to that one.
Yeah, the second fear is just in most families, homeschooling means only one parent's going to work full time. that means a parent is probably going to give up the opportunity for that second income. And that becomes a very personal, very significant choice. Every family has to make their own decision about what it's going to cost versus the benefit. So think about the loss of income versus think about your child being in public school and abandoning their faith. Because you as the parent have an ownership in that, and you will frankly do a better job. We moved into a house in a nearby town once and rented for a while. Before that, we'd owned our home, and my kids correctly recognized me as a yard nut. One day we pulled into our house, our rented house driveway, and my son said, "Dad, there are dandelions in our yard." I said, "No, son, there are dandelions in the landlord's lawn." And that kind of attitude that I don't need to worry about the dandelions because they're in someone else's lawn is what pervades the public school atmosphere. When a parent decides to homeschool, they're saying, "Those are my dandelions, my yard, I'm going to fix it."
Scott Woodruff, Homeschool Legal Defense, thank you for being with us. We're going to say goodbye to you right now. These two programs have been fantastic. I am so glad you are doing what you are doing. Ladies and gentlemen, stay with us. Isaac and I will conclude this program in just a moment.
Stand in the Gap is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different.
Sam, as we were just talking about some of the fears that potential homeschool parents have, it's hitting me. I'm like, yeah, those are things I worried about. But I'm living in an age now where I'm reaping benefits that others have sown before me. Where when our kids started, there's video curriculum. We use BJU Press video curriculum. It was really easy to get started. My wife and I are able to work mostly from home, and that's a normal thing, especially now in the last 3 years. But you were asking us, the decisions we went through in homeschooling, but you and Ruth Ann, you had a lot more difficult decisions at a time in the 1980s when it wasn't so normalized. What were some of the things that you guys had to decide and some of the things that pushed you into homeschooling?
Well, actually, Isaac, we were back in that pioneering, as we talked about in the last program. It was in the middle 80s when we began to homeschool our children. We had 5 then, and then or 4, I think, and then a couple more came after that. But our oldest son, who we homeschooled, began when he was in 6th grade. He's now 43. So that's where we've been in this process. But I will tell you, the primary reason was that we were finding that he was coming home when we sat down at the supper table. We were finding attitudes that were coming through, attitudes to his brothers and sisters, not loving attitudes and selfish attitudes. And we would say, "Where are you getting those?" And there were individuals, and we said, you know what? We said we can't continue to spend the amount of time undoing what is being learned. In fact, what he was learning was at a Christian school. It wasn't even a public school, but they were attitudes. And we were convinced, as Scott just said, the responsibility of educating our children, we believed God gave us. And we would answer to God for the values that were inculcated into our children. And it was really for that, the shaping of the attitudes of the heart and the mind, as well as academics. But we said, if we're going to really believe that God will hold us accountable, then we need to take responsibility for it. And that was it. And Isaac, we made the right choice. And ladies and gentlemen, that was our choice. But in every case, parents, you're watching, you need to choose very carefully. Don't just put your kids in a public school because it's the easiest thing to do. Consider, can you and how well are you imparting the values of fearing God and keeping His commandments into the heart of your children. Grandparents, you can have input into your children, grandchildren, even now, in many, 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 many ways. Educating our children, it's a duty given to us by God. Homeschooling is definitely one choice, and that's the reason we spent this week and last week on that theme. If you've not contacted us, please reach out to us this week. Let us know that you're watching this program, and God, if He's blessing you, tell us about it and how. Partner with us in prayer, please, always, and financially if God so leads.